Hi, good evening, everybody. Hi. Thank you all so much for being here at the Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California. Many of you know my name is Dion Lim, and I spent 20 years as a journalist, most recently 8, serving San Francisco and the Bay Area. I learned many things during my time serving San Francisco and beyond, that when you make a name for yourself, amplifying stories from communities involving those who feel unseen, those who feel unheard, and are in need of championing, you will be met with resistance. And I think to myself to this day that telling the truth is not always allowed. In fact, it is unfamiliar to some, it is downright uncomfortable to others, and quite frightening, at least in their eyes. But as a journalist, I realized that stories are what ignite emotion. And when there is emotion, that is what prompts other people to speak out, to make change, and to realize that we are not all scary and unfamiliar and all that different. And I think we are living in such important times, but times where the truth feels harder to find and much easier to distort. And I think we are forced so many times to pivot. And that was part of my decision in a career sense to make a pivot, because we have to protect the fundamentals of storytelling. It's why I feel so strongly about the club. I had to do that pivot in my own career. Many of you, perhaps, have had to do that, reassess in your own lives. And for my portion, I leave you with something that I shared with the folks at City Hall earlier this summer when I received a commendation from San Francisco's Board of Supervisors. It is this: during these challenging times, when we are gaslit, when sometimes our beliefs, our ideas, the pillars of what makes us tick are marginalized and we feel 2 inches tall, we need 2 things. Look around you here tonight. Those 2 things are the truth and your community, because I believe that those are the 2 things that will help us all prevail. I swear I'm not running for office with remarks like that. But it really does illustrate, I should? Ask me again later. You know, the club is such a special place, and I don't know if you know the history of it. I certainly didn't until only recently, but the club started back in 1903 with a group of civic leaders who said, we need to have more discussions, because through talking is how we can make change to some of our most dire problems in the world. These were leaders who were, at the time, the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, or the president of the University of California, even an attorney who later became a justice on the California Supreme Court. And that is what we're trying to do here at the club. We try to continue that dialogue, that spirit, because we are this community of educators, of community leaders, of everyday folks who believe that having mutual respect and civilized discussion and continuing to learn is our everyday goal, and that is how we find solutions, that is how we make change. Which brings me to tonight's very special guest. I am so excited because Jay Kuo is chair-elect of the Human Rights Campaign. This is the nation's largest LGBTQ+ civil rights organization. And he also leads the Public Policy Committee to help elect equity-focused candidates all across the country. He's also the CEO of Social Edge. It's a digital publishing company behind Team Takei, which helped. Oh, I know. George is in the house, right? Yes. He is the one who actually helped George build his insane social media following of 25 million fans. Yeah. He also writes a daily Substack. It's called The Status Quo. I think we've got some subscribers in the house. And believe it or not, it attracts 5 million readers a month. Jay is a two-time Tony-winning co-producer, and he is developing new productions also in the UK. And I'm going to go off script for a moment because when I was chatting with Jay in the green room, he told me all of these opportunities happened when he decided to uproot himself from San Francisco, move to New York City. He saw a musical, and guess who was sitting behind him? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. And when those opportunities present themselves, it is your job to open the door and to grab it and to run and see what happens. He has such a long bio, I told him I wouldn't bore everyone with all the details, but you should know that he also served on the boards of the Northern California ACLU and the Bay Area Lawyers for Individual Freedom. He now lives in New York City, where he is a single dad to two beautiful, very adorable infants, Riley and Ronan. Moderating tonight's discussion is my dear friend who also has a long bio but would never let me read all of it, Michelle Miao, who is a member of the Board of Governors for the Commonwealth Club. Please welcome to the stage, everyone, Jay and Michelle.
Wow. Wow. Jay, look at this room. Welcome home.
Thank you. It feels like home.
Yeah. Well, I mean, doesn't it though? The Bay does feel that way.
You know, I was just up on the roof with my good friend Blair, and we were looking out and just commenting how beautiful it really is. It's just such a beautiful city. It feels so nice to be here.
So, you know, I thought we were going to spend an entire hour talking about all these big major issues, but reading the headline news, I feel like is there much to say? I mean, Mayor Mamdani and the president had such a love fest. Everything's fine in America
everything's
now.
fine, folks. We can all go home. No, that's a really strange image to see on your phone, as you're crossing the bridge, and we were listening to President Trump go on in a wax about this man that he had just condemned earlier as a communist, and say, he's got a lot of great ideas. He wants to build apartments. I could live comfortably in New York. I'm like, wow, you're like a dog who has just come in and rolled on its back and had its tummy rubbed. It was it was very bizarre, but it goes to show that these events are unpredictable. You know, Fox News had been promoting this as the showdown on socialism. And instead, it's more like the gutting of Elise Stefanik's political career. Because she was going to run her whole campaign on the fact that he's a jihadist. And Trump was asked directly, do you think he's a jihadist? And he says, no, I think I was talking to a very rational man. And so now her campaign folks are rewriting everything right now. Saying, got to scratch the jihadist out, right? So and one of the most shocking thing came when Mamdani was asked, you called him a fascist. Mm-hmm. And it put Mamdani on the spot. He's standing right there, and Trump sort of lets him off the spot by saying, "You can go ahead. You can say it. It's easy. It'll be easier than trying to explain." And Mamdani goes, "Yes." I'm like, wow. Okay.
I guess that might be the nicest thing right now if you had names or other names. We'll get to that. But in other news, while you were up on the rooftop, right, Representative
All right. I don't know if you've seen this. Marjorie
Greene.
Taylor Greene has announced she's resigning from Congress effective January 6th.
Yep.
Right. I think she's preparing for some kind of higher office run, but I'm not sure. I don't trust that woman. I do not trust her. I like what she did at the end. But you know what's really fascinating? She took on the right for about 5 days at the end, and she's getting death threats.
Yeah.
She took on the left for years. Didn't need security. I think it's something for people to think about. the violence in this country, the real threats in this country are coming from the right, and the right knows it. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is a good example of what happens when you cross them, right? And so maybe she's stepping down for personal reasons because she can't take the level of threats. You know, Jason Crow tonight, I read, he's also had to beef up his security, and there are death threats being left on his voicemails because he dared say, among 5 other Democrats, that if you're a member of the military, you should not follow illegal orders. Well, that's actually the law, right? So he's being attacked for stating the law.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
What times we're in.
You know, at times. We definitely will cover a lot of what you had just mentioned, but let's reset very quickly. You know, I always ask a coming out story when we begin our programs here because it is the only LGBTQIA plus inclusive resident program here, so I might as well.
Yeah, sure.
And just take a page right out of your book, Ma, in all caps.
Yeah.
Please do this the honor and share with us your coming out story.
All right, the very abbreviated version of this is I decided, as any good Asian son should do, to traumatize my family by coming out on Christmas. And I was about 25 years old, and I'd been dating the same guy for 5 years, and my parents are starting to run out of excuses. And so I went down the hallway, and they were still in bed, and I started. I don't even remember exactly what I was saying. My mother said, "Come sit on the bed, come talk to us." And it wasn't going so well, actually, because she said that she was going to try introducing me to 1,000 girls before she would accept this what was coming from me. She wound up introducing me to 3 and gave up. But she was hiding under the most memorable part of this, though. My father was trying to console her. She was hiding under the covers crying. My brothers came in, and everyone was focusing on her. She sort of stole my moment, right? So everyone was focusing on her, trying to get her to calm down. My brother's like, well, it's gonna be okay. I mean, Mom, it's fine. He's gay. My mom is crying, and then she looks at him and winks. He told me this later, right? So I was like, wow, Mom was doing all of that to try to calm my father down, because then he would have to be the one calming her down, right? And being calm and trying to tell her it was going to be okay. And so she had manipulated everybody in the room. And so that was my mom's triumphant day, and then my coming out day. It's all wrapped in one. So.
Thank you so much for that. Thanks for
Sure,
entertaining.
sure.
I wanted it on the record before we got into some real drama. So let's just do this. By the way, audience, we would love your questions. We left some question cards for you. We have a volunteer who will come around and grab them. And I think if we get a good chunk of it, I'll kind of just go through them with my own questions. Mm-hmm. So Jay, we are, I don't know, I was going to say a pickle or maybe something worse, but a lot of the issues or concerns that we have are coming through the court systems, right? So yes. Lower courts and then all the way up to the Supreme Court. So I think that's where we start to try to process some of these major concerns. I mean, from the president being able to fire federal government workers to blowing up boats in the Caribbean Sea to right. The immigration policies. Walk us through kind of how you're navigating these issues.
Well, it's interesting when so many things are happening. Sometimes it's best, I think, to just climb up out of the zone and try to get a broader look at what's happening. It's important to understand that most of these things come down to the question of something called the unitary executive theory. And it's a fancy way of saying he gets to be king, right? It's a fancy way of saying that more like a CEO, the president has full control over all the executive branches, that there's no check that Congress can make within the executive branch, for example, inspector generals or people that can't be fired except for cause, that somehow the president gets to say it all and do it all. And that the courts take a back seat and don't challenge the decisions that the executive makes. And this could be about the military. It could be about designating certain people as terrorists. It could be about saying that, who knows, that autism is caused by vaccines. None of that stuff is, challengeable under this unitary executive theory because the king and the state are the same, right? And that's the sort of extreme version of, and the question really is how far along that path is the Supreme Court going to drag us? Because there are certain members, certainly Alito and Thomas, who want to drag us all the way. And then there's this sort of Gorsuch who's like everybody except the Native Americans, right? And then there's these center votes. And it's crazy to think that Kavanaugh is a center vote and Roberts is a center vote because they were considered for pretty far right before. But the Overton window has shifted. And so we're dealing with trying to keep us from sliding all the way over to the right on the question of the unitary executive theory. So thinking of it that way, the other question is, well, the court still only gets to decide actual cases and controversies that are put before it, right? So, but in this case, there are so many, because there's so many things that this executive has done through orders and through policies that are immediately challenged and in the court, and people are trying to enjoin. And so the courts get clogged up pretty quickly, and what happens is judges have to make sort of snap decisions about whether this policy that they've just been imposed should be what's called stayed, stopped while the case winds its way through, or whether they're going to allow the policy to continue until they can have a bigger, more robust record to assess. What's generally been happening is that the district courts look at this, say, on the merits, the government's likely to lose, I'm going to put stay. And then you've probably seen in the headlines that they run to the appellate courts, and then they run to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court winds up saying, we're going to lift the stay. We're not going to tell you why. We're going to do it on something called our emergency docket. This is something that the court used to not use very much because there weren't that many cases that would come up that needed emergency review. There weren't so many things that were going to upend the way things are done. And now there are so many that the court is saying, well, let's rely on the emergency docket. We don't have to issue any reasoning. We just have to say our opinion. What happens is, and the reason it feels so bad is that the court just keeps letting all these bad things happen without explaining why. And not ever making a real ruling on a lot of them. And I think that's the most dangerous aspect to all this. None of us exactly, all of us lawyers are looking and said, we actually don't know if you are allowing this case to continue because you don't believe the plaintiffs have standing, for example, or you think that there's no actual damage, or you actually disagree with the fundamentals and the merits of the case. You didn't tell us, so how do we proceed? Right? It's all sort of left up in the air. It's a terrible place, I think, for a society that prides itself on the rule of law to be left without clear guidance from the Supreme Court. I guess the only thing worse than that would be if they gave us very clear guidance every time and said, you're wrong because we hate you and you're always going to be wrong. Right?
Yeah.
They haven't gotten there, but I think they're trying to inch that way.
Once you articulated that whole process, it does feel a lot more terrifying. And in our prep call, basically, in simple people's terms, I'm like, let me process this. So if the Supreme Court isn't actually ruling on the law, and then the government itself is breaking the law, well then, how do we hold people accountable? Where do we go from here?
It's very hard to hold people completely accountable in this situation, and it actually has a perverse incentive for the government to fire as many things as it can out, hoping that nothing can get really stopped, or if things that do get stopped are only stopped temporarily. And so it's, we call it lawfare. They try to flood the zone, so the civil rights groups and the Blue Attorney States General, they try to flood the zone back with lawsuits. Now, I should say, in many cases, the court, even with all these emergency stays, cannot actually handle all of the matters that are coming at it. And so you have a lot of instances where there's been a victory at the district court level, there's been a stay put in place, or an injunction to for example, fund these research grants. You know, where the blue states got together, blue state attorneys general got together, and they were far more successful in getting funds returned to the blue states than the red states were, which didn't fight this stuff. And so, you know, Rob Bonta here in this state was extremely successful at getting funding restored on a lot of levels that had been illegally and unconstitutionally impounded by, you know, the OMB. So I think that's really, really worth mentioning. It's always worth fighting because you never sort of like, even though you will lose and it'll feel like the waters are still seeping out, you know, you're stopping a complete deluge. And so that's the game we're in right now.
Stopping the deluge.
Stopping the deluge.
Okay. I want to segue to the use of military troops and, you know, who actually has the power to
For the light stuff.
get all through the heavy stuff, because I know our audience is probably going to ask, you know, even heavier things too. But I mean, in all seriousness, right, here in San Francisco, so we had a couple billionaires be able to change the president's mind, and so they didn't end up occupying San Francisco. Sadly, those couple of billionaires did not speak for the entire country, but it begs this huge question of, you know, what kind of power, who has this, does the president have the sweeping powers to basically call for military troops to occupy locally anywhere for any reason?
So, broadly speaking, the president does not have the power to send in U.S. federal troops to perform state-level actions, police actions, because of something called the Posse Comitatus Act. And that's a law from the 1870s, I believe, or 60s, that basically said, no, the federal troops, it was actually in the South, they're like, get out. You don't have the right to act like our police. It's interesting that something that was sort of rooted in a drive to preserve white supremacy in the South now stands as a bulwark against fascism when the fascists are in power in Washington. So, you know, but Posse Comitatus Act, actually what it does is it criminalizes anybody who attempts to use federal troops as state police. And so it's been extended a little bit to say, well, it must be, since it's a crime, then you also can have an injunction against a president or White House that tries to do that. But there are some exceptions to the Posse Comitatus Act. One of them is Title X, which was used here in California. And under Title X, if there's active rebellion or some sort of emergency, if the governor requests it, you could have troops come in. So the question was, what if the governor doesn't request it? Well, there's been some instances in the past, again, in the civil rights era, where the governors were sort of like, we don't want you, but they sent them in anyway. So there's some murky areas there that are sort of hard to square with what the arguments that we on the left are making today. They say, you can't do that because Governor Newsom was not consulted, et cetera. But there's actually even a nerdier question. Title X actually says you can only send those people in if the regular forces are insufficient. So the question is, who are the regular forces? Is it like the police? Is it, or does he mean the military? And it looks like there was an interesting amicus brief. Yeah, I actually read these amicus briefs. Amicus brief submitted by a Georgetown law professor that pointed out that the legislative history of Title X indicates that regular forces means the U.S. Army. It doesn't mean local police. So unless the U.S. Army is incapable of solving this problem, and then you can call in the National Guard on top of them. That's what that Title X apparently was supposed to mean. So it's very interesting. I think it was Justice Amy Coney Barrett or others may have actually raised this. And now they want additional briefing on this question. Does Title X actually require a first consideration of whether the U.S. Army would have been insufficient to stop whatever rebellion was happening? Of course, I'm not sure we want the U.S. Army to first be tested. That's a separate question, but in this case, Trump did not do so. Now, under what circumstances can the U.S. Army be sent into a blue city, right? And Posse Comitatus says no unless there's a rebellion, but there's something also. There's another exception, and it's called the Insurrection Act. And it's something that everybody sort of had to dust off their law books and look up again and understand, because this hasn't been used for quite some time. But basically, Trump says that I can declare anything an insurrection, I can use it whenever I want and send them in, right? And that's obviously, if the unitary executive people are right, then he gets to say what is a rebellion or what is an insurrection. If January 6th was not an insurrection, I don't know how a bunch of people in inflatable dinosaur outfits is an insurrection. But, the logic there isn't important as apparently to the unitary executives. So you've got this Insurrection Act hanging above all of us right now. Could he declare San Francisco to be an insurrection and send in the troops? And for how long, right? So it's an interesting question. I think that even this White House would want something a little bit more scary than what we're seeing outside the ICE detention centers. They would want to see something on the level of the George Floyd protests, right? They want to see Black Lives Matter level, burning or looting, so the Fox News doesn't have to keep showing the same Waymo on fire all the time, right? So, that's what they want. And so the answer in Stephen Miller's head, I'm sure, is if we provoke them enough, then they will protest enough. And if they protest enough, we have the justification we need to invoke the Insurrection Act. But again, then you have to ask the next question, to what end? How long do you keep troops in, and what do they do? Well, we've seen in D.C. they're sort of this problem. They're mulching, right? They're bored and they're away from their families, and they're serving no purpose. And a federal judge just ruled yesterday, I believe, that the deployment of federal troops in D.C. is now illegal, and they need to withdraw within 21 days. That's on appeal. It's going to be very interesting to see where that goes. But I think one of the reasons he wants to invoke the Insurrection Act will be so as the election approaches, he can scare more people into staying home. I think one of the reasons he doesn't like mail-in voting is because you can't scare people into not putting something into a post office box. And so, worst case scenario, he thinks around November of next year, he starts putting troops into big major cities. But I don't know if he really thought this out, because that's not going to change the outcome of the Electoral College or even some of these House races. So next year, it's like the House races that are tight are not in these blue cities. They're just, either the blue cities have been divided up and gerrymandered like Nashville or Austin has been, or they're solidly blue. So putting troops around the blue cities is not going to accomplish anything. He's going to have to put them in the sort of the purple, flippable zones.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of Texas. It's a lot of Florida. It's a lot of. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if they've really thought this completely through.
Well, obviously not. But I'm still waiting for you, though, to go back to the rebellion part, the insurrection part. I mean, what kind of evidence would they need? Do they need evidence? Mm-hmm. What would need to happen in order for them to be able to declare? The Seventh Circuit looked at the Chicago case and approved the fact that there was not sufficient evidence of a rebellion. They can't just wave their hand and say it's a rebellion and that's enough. There has to be some colorable connection between your stated desire to put down whatever you claim is happening and the truth, right? There was just no evidence. Same thing in Portland. And so I think that, they're sort of, those aren't great cases to make their way up to the Supreme Court from the White House's standpoint. I think the Supreme Court's going to try to find a technical way to
kick this, for example, by saying, well, you should have called out the Army first. That's what that actually says. I'd love to be right on that, but then I'm also worried about what he's going to do if told that. So, I want to assure people one thing. It's like, I used to litigate a lot against the military. I filed the first Don't Ask, Don't Tell challenge back in 1996. And yeah, we lost. You don't have to clap, we lost. But it was very eye-opening, and I learned a lot about the military. I also learned how the limitations of our military. And, we're a very, very large country. And people talk about, oh, we're going to be under martial law. It's like, okay, so martial law, when you look at it, martial law means that the military takes over all aspects of civilian government. Judges, jails, police, everything. It's like, we don't have the people power to do that in our military, not when they're deployed all over the place, right, all over the world. Where are they going to have that sort of ability to actually run everything under martial law? We don't have the size of the resources, and this country is just far too big. And if the governors don't play along, I don't see it in the cards. So that's one sort of nice heavy weight on the side of democracy, is that our military is just not set up to run in this country under martial law. The only way this country can be run under martial law is if everybody capitulates and gives in and doesn't put up any resistance, so that one soldier can control a lot of things. I also don't see that happening.
We're going to end on a good note, I promise, everyone. We are going to talk about, yes, hopeful possibilities.
Yeah.
And I have a laundry list of a lot of things that I wanted to ask you about, especially, you covered it through your social media and Substack. And I'm like, oh, man, it's overwhelming, from immigration to LGBTQIA plus rights, which, yes, we should talk about that, especially the attacks on the transgender community.
Yeah, for me, that attack is quite personal. My nephew is trans, and I was very proud of him. He was on 60 Minutes as an open trans teenager. And I thought to myself, if he can be that brave and face up to the kind of bullying he might receive as a result of that, then I can step up for my community. And that's when I decided to join the Human Rights Campaign. So the attacks on trans community, I want to put things in a historical perspective, because, when I see politicians attacking the trans community, I think of the first bonfires in Berlin. A lot of people think that the first books in Berlin were written by Jewish intellectuals or communist intellectuals. No, the first institute that they attacked was the Institute of Health, and the first books they burned were on trans health. And so, so I know that they are dog whistling to the far right, as well as playing a very familiar tune historically by attacking a sexual minority that is misunderstood, reviled in many parts of the society, politically powerless. It is the ultimate form of bullying. And so, when I see commercials run against the trans community, or I see even some of our own allies say, we have to walk away because this is killing us politically. I'm like, no. If we walk away, we are doing the work of the fascists.
Right.
Because that's what they want. They want to prove that we will walk away from our most vulnerable people at their highest time of need. And I won't walk away because I'm not a fascist. And I think that we can flip the script on those who are trying to divide us and make us fear. And we could show that it's actually a losing battle for them. Winsome Sears, she's kooky in a lot of ways, but she was the GOP candidate in Virginia, and I don't know if you followed this, but a lot of her campaign was anti-trans because they thought that they could carry that momentum forward from the 24 election, the whole they-them argument. It didn't work. She got crushed. And I think people are exhausted. People are aware now that they're being manipulated. And when when they come out and they lead with fear and they lead with hate, we call them out on it first and say, you're doing this because you don't have solutions. You actually don't know how to make lives better for others, so you tell others, you're just better than this group. And somehow you think that that's going to make a meal for them. And it maybe lasted for a few years, but it is exhausting. Fear is exhausting, hate is exhausting, and people are tired. And I think that it's a time now for hope and support and community. And I think those are going to be the winning messages going into next year's election.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, the funny thing is, so just recently, RFK released some medical research. It's not even, I mean, the stuff is fluff. There aren't even medical doctors who have verified the information on this research that he had just unleashed. And a lot of it is bias, obviously, anti-trans, and, comes up with this whole thing that says, puberty blockers, gender-affirming care is actually harmful for gender diverse, gender variant children. And this is the guy who heads our, public health agency. But to your point, I think that for many parents who are starting to understand, discover, many parents who love their children, this is all starting to sound and look like a bunch of crock. And I say this because I think that there's something optimistic happening where the parents are just ditching these ideas, these arguments that they have. I don't know if you hear from other parents, you're a parent yourself, but I think that we have to believe in, parents and their love for their children at this point, and to say, yeah, we shouldn't believe things that are not scientifically backed, or these folks who are now heading these agencies that have no experience.
Right, I think, the same sort of things that can lead somebody into a conspiracy-driven mindset, that can actually crack fairly over time, very readily, as soon as they have any personal experience that seems contrary to what's happening. And that's why I think that for example, the work of the Human Rights Campaign, we have a whole foundation that has a Welcoming Schools initiative. And we train educators on how to, have program on how to welcome trans kids in and how to make everyone feel included and feel safe, but also how cisgendered kids can sort of ask the right questions and not feel embarrassed and feel like they're all part of a small community. And there's not enough of that kind of resource, but I think we trained something like 20,000 educators last year, and that has a large ripple effect. That's the kind of stuff that the right is really afraid of. They don't understand it. They think it's indoctrination when it's really just compassion. And so when compassion looks like indoctrination, you need to wonder where your priorities really are, right? What are they afraid of? And acknowledging that some people don't understand what's happening to their child, or what's being taught in the schools around this, because it wasn't taught to them. It can be scary, and I think that that's why it's so important that we win elections at the school board level, so that we can have policies that are based in science and that are kid focused, rather than book bans and bans on critical race theory and other things. So the good news was, in the last election, we'll get to the election later, but on this particular question, I was really heartened to see that MAGA lost at the school board level across the nation. I think in the end, Moms for Liberty, they ran something like 36 candidates, and only a couple of them actually kept their seats, and everybody else got wiped out. And so that's terrific. That's a huge change. And I think everyone realizes, we weren't ready for, acrimonious PTA meetings, right? Where do these people come from? And everyone was sort of shell-shocked for a while. And we had just come out of pandemic, and it's like, oh my God, this is nuts. And so we weren't organized, and we didn't understand the danger. And it took 2 horrible years for a lot of folks to sort of mobilize and get together and have a critical mass and fight back, right? And so 2025 was the year that really folks at the local level, school board level, fought back and won in Pennsylvania and in Bucks County, I mean, of all places, right? So
We're going to get to more of
Yeah.
election results, and then where do we go from here? Look at all these questions,
Oh my
though, that I
goodness.
got to get through. And while I read through them, though, we're going to play a little thing where I read verbatim, like responses and statements, and following the spirit and the track of, do these people actually know what they're doing? You can respond either by chuckling or saying something intelligent. So I
this is being streamed, right? Okay.
it is. I'm just reading. These aren't my words. I'm not even contextualizing or adding more words or anything. I'm just going to read exactly what these folks have said. So in response to the president calling a Bloomberg reporter piggy, Carolyn Levitt responds with, "Look, the president is very frank and honest with everyone in this room. You've all seen it yourselves. You've all experienced it yourselves. And I think it's one of the many reasons the American people reelected this president, because of his frankness. He calls out fake news when he sees it. He gets frustrated with reporters when you lie about him, when you spread fake news about him and his administration. But he also is the most transparent president in history, and he gives all of you in this room, as you all know, unprecedented access. You are in the Oval Office almost every day asking the president questions." The most transparent president in our history?
Well, I think it actually is better in the original North Korean.
I took this straight up from his book, The Author. And the title of the book is called Government Gangsters, The Deep State, the Truth, and the Battle for Our Democracy. This is, the author is our FBI director, Kash Patel. So straight up from the book. I regularly used to tell people that the fastest way to move up in the government is to just screw up. And the bigger the screw up, the bigger the promotion. Every person implicated in your mistakes has an interest in covering up what they did, so they will promote you. That means the people at the very top are usually the most immoral, unethical people in the entire agency.
And he's been proven correct. But, I find it, I don't know if you saw the press conference after the Epstein file vote. There's Kash Patel standing behind, looking typically shell-shocked. And, it's going to be really interesting. A lot of people worry that the FBI is going to go tamper with the evidence now. I just think that Kash Patel is not the kind of guy that knows how to get away with something that big. As I said in my newsletter, he can't even hide the fact that he's flying around to visit his girlfriend, in government planes, and so he doesn't have the juice, and he knows it. He's there because he was a successful right-wing podcaster, but the rank and file of the FBI do not respect him, and it's almost like the kind of a tragic play. He's like walking almost like a Shakespearean play where he's everybody, following him around knows exactly why he's failed up to this point. And at any moment, it's all going to come crashing down. Not that I really feel sorry for Kash Patel, but I think that what he wrote was actually prescient.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to there are a lot of questions about the Supreme Court and the question of, kind of where do we go from here? So I'm just going to summarize some of them. So in a post-Trump world, do you think it will be important to overturn bad SCOTUS decisions, or more important to reestablish the importance of
Stare decisis.
There you go, stare decisis, structural norms of the legal system.
I'm going to one up on this. I think that Supreme Court reform has to begin with an expansion of the court. I also think that we need to look at term limits. it needs to be depoliticized in a way. And I'm not sure, there are lots of proposals out there, but you can't get to that point unless you also eliminate the filibuster. And so, we can't make the changes that we need to make to fix this democracy unless we get rid of the thing that is allowing minority rule, and that is the filibuster. Now, it's a scary thing to get rid of the filibuster when the Republicans are in power, right? Because they could pass all these terrible things with just 50 votes in the Senate. But when you think about it, the Republicans are all, the kinds of things the Republicans want, they can always jam into what's called a reconciliation bill, which is an economically based sort of a budget bill, and pass it with 50. So they can usually get what they want without using the filibuster. Democrats can't. Democrats want things like voting rights, civil rights, and abortion rights, and all of those things, can be blocked by the filibuster. And I think that is fundamentally unfair. And so to get the kind of reform we need leaders willing to say, we're going to begin carve-outs for the filibuster or give it up completely. We need statehood for Puerto Rico, for D.C. None of the things are possible so long as the filibuster stands in the way. The reason we didn't get minimum wage, other things, is because, we had senators not willing to do what was necessary. And one of the things that is necessary this time around is looking at the entire picture, realizing that we are going to be back here again unless we fix the thing that is preventing our democracy from being a true representative democracy. And I think the filibuster has got to go.
Yep. Do you think that there is a possibility of success for Christopher Armitage's suggestion that we can investigate and charge Trump and his cabinet, please, in an exclamation mark, and perp walk, exclamation mark. I just had to read it all, okay?
I think that's two different questions. I think that Trump's people are vulnerable to prosecution later, and they should understand that now. Because the immunity that the Supreme Court gave to Trump is fairly broad, or to any president. It's fairly broad. It will preclude a lot of what ought to be able to be brought against the president. But it doesn't shield people like Stephen Miller. It doesn't shield Kristi Noem, right? It doesn't shield the grifters and the sadists and the anti-constitutionalists and from the criminal acts, from the accountability for their criminal behavior. I'm all for a robust accountability when we retake government. And I think that one of the reasons, again, we are here is because the last time this country went through a huge upheaval and led to a civil war, we were not harsh enough upon the actual insurrectionists. Mm-hmm. We let the Confederacy continue, and it just mutated, right? And when you don't root it out, you'll be faced with the same problems later. So yes, for the Stephen Millers of the world, our version of the Nuremberg trials. Yeah. And I hope he's listening. It is a weird thing to know that there was just a report yesterday that the FBI was spying on a group of activists, immigration activists, who were gathering on private signal groups and other things. The FBI was actually tapping those. And so, if you are a member of the active left, if you're a part of what they think is the resistance, they call it resistance, chances are somebody's paying attention, trying to figure out if you're doing something wrong or whether you should be on the list.
Oh, I'm on a list somewhere, I guess.
Yeah.
But you are probably too.
Kash Patel had a list in his book, right? He actually put the names in, right?
Yeah.
So this is not some hypothetical thing, but I think that we ought not to be afraid of that. We ought to understand that this is how fascists are, and have always been, that if we start to back down out of anticipation of what might happen to us personally, then we're doing their work for them. This is, and that's, again, Timothy Snyder. If you haven't read his book, his work, you should read it. His number one rule is don't capitulate in advance. That applies not just to business leaders, not just to civic leaders, but to journalists, to ordinary folks, especially in these times. One of the most heartening things I saw out of Charlotte was how the people responded, knowing now what they'd seen in Portland, what they'd seen in Chicago. In churches all across Portland, in Charlotte, they gathered to have ICE response training. You saw moms come out with their cell phones and following the ICE agents around. You saw people yelling at them to get out. And they're gone from Charlotte. They packed up and they said, our work is done here. We're leaving. Yeah. So, they are not the bravest people. We are the braver people.
I was kind of joking about, being on this list or anything. I just want you to know, if you are listening, the people that we were talking about today, I'm nobody, and I have no money, and I'm nobody. Okay, but the pressure though does cause a whole lot of stress,
right.
And I stress about it a lot. And this question comes from a young person here. Thank you, young person, for being here. Really appreciate you, and you are the reason that we just keep going. So as a young person, I am consistently reminded by older generations that what is happening is not normal. And yet this level of divisiveness feels like it's all I know. How do you recommend we all keep perspective and maintain our mental health in such an overwhelming, bizarre world? I agree, Vivian. Thank you.
So I heard the smartest thing from a psychologist that was talking about the subject of happiness. And she said that they sort of divide happiness into whether you are happy in your life and whether you're happy with your life. And as soon as she said that, I started realizing that has applicability when it comes to our politics. We can be happy in America even when we are not happy with America. And it's really important to understand that those things are not in contradiction to each other. In fact, it's absolutely necessary to find happiness in America at a time when we are very unhappy with the way America is going. Because it is our joy that fuels us. It gives us reason to keep fighting. It reminds us of the things we value. And so, when I see injustice happening to somebody else, I can think, how would I feel if that injustice were happening to my family? Right? It's a really important ability to have that kind of empathy. And so in difficult times like this, to find the things that make you happy in your life, and to understand that if the reasons you are unhappy with America are making your life unhappy, then you need to stop doom scrolling. And you need to find the things that bring you joy, because without that, you cannot be a strong fighter for the things that we need. And so, I regularly tell people, turn off social media, go outside, touch the grass, just enjoy. We are not at the point where at every waking hour, unless we choose to be this way, we are filled with an anxious dread. Sometimes it happens when we read the headlines. That is understandable. But we need to be able to say, and yet, I hold my children. I cherish my friends. I enjoy my work. I do the things I do. I garden, I cook, I travel, and I love. All of those things you can continue to do and still say, and I am going to fight as hard as I can for this democracy and for this republic. Those things are, I think a lot of people get swept up in the doom, and it's understandable. It is very understandable. In fact, if you weren't affected by what you're seeing on the news, then you're probably not paying attention enough, or you're not understanding actually what the danger that we're in. It does not mean, however, that we become paralyzed or that we let those things destroy the things that bring us joy. So learning how to divide those two worlds and hold those two ideas at once is how to, I think, to survive this era.
Thank you. We have 13 minutes left, and there's still two questions that I want to ask as we end. I know, but and a lot of the questions actually point to the last question you and I agreed that we would talk about, which is the results of the election. Where do we go from here? How do we hold people accountable? But this is a good one. With so much fake news, where are your reliable sources from which you compose your daily summaries, and how much confidence do you have that we will continue to have access to the facts?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. The first thing that any good fascist does is try to control the media, right? You see that with Orban, Putin, and you see it with Trump. It's not surprising, and it's also distressing while it's happening in real time. You know, I love the fact that there are independent journalists now, and reporters of the truth like Heather Cox Richardson, like Joyce Vance, people on Substack. There are also folks all across what we still call Twitter who are struggling along there and they're experts, they're epidemiologists, they are scientists, they're researchers, they're politicians, they're lawyers, they're immigration experts. Those are the folks I follow religiously and often amplify. So, I think that one of the keys to keeping good information is to sort of limit who your sources and who your trusted sources are, because even if you say, well, Washington Post, they're good. Well, I don't know if you saw the editorial that just came out today, sort of praising the one person who voted against the Epstein files. I was like, okay, so purchased, a complete capitulation by Jeff Bezos on that. So we have to be smarter these days. The news and information is more distributed. There are lots of ways to access it. Do not do so via social media. Unless you're following a respected journalist or trusted source, but what your uncle or grandma said that's the real danger. I think, people act like their trusted sources are their friends and family who are getting their things from their networks, and so there's a lot of misinformation. I think that sticking to foreign sources, also like the BBC, is very helpful because they don't have as much skin in the game. Although they kind of capitulated a little bit to Trump too. So it's Britain's going a little MAGA light sometimes. So
yeah. Speaking of Epstein files, can we just spend a couple minutes on that very quick? I mean, we heard from Attorney General Bondi, who suddenly says there's some new information and an investigation coming. Something like that.
The investigation she closed down in July suddenly has new information that's going to prevent her from releasing more. But so here's the thing, we've always known that they will do everything they can to slow down whatever is in those files from coming out. That it shows that Trump is really worried about whatever it is that is in those files. But I think it's a strategic mistake to not rip the Band-Aid, unless the Band-Aid is unrippable because he'll bleed to death, right? To not rip the Band-Aid because it just puts back in the headlines every time the victims group or others demands a release and sues, and there's court hearings, and the Epstein Files Transparency Act itself limits the withholding of the files to cases where there's new information, but it has to be narrowly tailored to that new case, and it has to be temporary. And so they're going to be fighting in the courts about this if they sort of use the new information idea or the new case idea to withhold files. This has always been about gaining political leverage. I don't know that we'll ever know what the truth is behind all of that. These presidential conspiracies, we don't know what happened. We didn't know, for example, that Reagan had made a deal with Iran. We had heard that was possible over the hostages until many, many, many decades later, right, when it was reported. And so, I'm not sure that we will in this election cycle know the truth. And even if we do, I'm not sure how much the American public will accept what that truth is. And so the more important question is, how long are they going to keep trying to hide this? Because the longer they go, the worse it seems, and the more faith is lost. And so it's a political game. Sad as it is that we have to play political games around questions this serious. But they actually started it. They with the whole QAnon stuff. They started this conspiracy, of a ring of pedophiles at the highest levels of government. Like, well, it turns out half of that was true. It's just not, not the way they thought it would roll.
Yeah.
Strange times, right? Strange times to find ourselves. But it was not about a pizza parlor. It was not about Hillary Clinton, right? It was, whatever is in those files is probably more bizarre than we could probably imagine.
I'm envisioning a scene from Squid Games or something. So in this hand are questions that I think relate to our very last question that we wanted to cover, which would be the election results and some hope.
Right.
But I'm going to take one more question from this pile, just so then we can cover almost everybody's questions. I think, well, okay, I know this is going to be covered. So this question here, do you have any plans to return to your musical theater roots in any political adjacent productions in your future?
I've been developing some new musicals over in England. One of them is about a group of queer artists that originated here in San Francisco called the Cockettes. And they're from the late 1960s. You had John Waters, Divine, Sylvester. They were all performing at the Palace Theater at midnight. It's called Midnight at the Palace. We have a little show that we did at the Fringe this summer, and we're developing it over in England. But I think it's time that we had a sort of in-your-face, out and proud, story about gender-bending artists. I think it could be the new kind of Hair or Rent that just could explode upon the scene. I think it's also time to tell stories where people are unapologetically who they are, and give a big middle finger to the religious right. So I don't know if that's political. I think it's just people being who they are. Yeah. So.
Okay, so here's to hope. The last question, a lot of folks were concerned about the future of MAGA. You and I kind of had this conversation, right? And you had mentioned that the election results, November 4th, does point towards big hope. I mean, like a big potential blue wave. I had said maybe the end of MAGA. You said maybe the end of the Republican Party as we know it. But we'll let you answer that. What do we think might happen in 2026? Where do we go from here? Right.
So, it's important to look first of all, we should all be very happy about that election result from earlier in the year. That's, people worked very, very hard for that to happen. It didn't happen by magic. There was a lot of door knocking and a lot of time spent trying to make sure that we didn't make the mistakes of earlier. But there was something in the air, and I think that the thing that really struck me is the shifts among particular groups of voters. When I looked at the numbers, and I saw, and you'll be happy to hear this, Asian American voters, AAPI voters in New Jersey had the actual largest swing, a 42 points swing from the 2024. And a lot of that has to do with affordability questions and the immigration question, right? Because they see what's happening, and they know that Trump has broken his promise that he was going to target only criminal elements, and instead is coming after hardworking, otherwise law-abiding people. So, and the same thing happened with the Latino community in New Jersey and in Virginia. And the swings there are catastrophically large for the GOP. They won the last election because they were able to capture the Latino vote or at least, basically make it a tie instead of sort of a 63 or 68 to the Democratic side. We have now swung all the way back and past that, and the momentum is continuing to grow. There are 36 House districts that are considered Latino influence districts, where if we saw those kinds of swings happen in those districts, it would be a blowout in the midterms. And so, so that gives me a lot of hope, because I don't think anything that the administration is doing now is going to win back those Latino voters. In fact, if anything, they're doubling down. The reason it's going to get worse is because they're hiring a lot more ICE agents. So the big, beautiful bill, and I'm sure he didn't mean Bill Clinton at that, but the big, beautiful bill is going to hire 10,000 new ICE agents in, and that's going to create this much more chaos. They're going to build actual, billions, tens of billions of dollars spent on detention centers. So, and the communities most impacted by those will be the Latino community and the Asian American community. And those voters are abandoning the GOP. Now, here in California, we know what happened when Pete Wilson did something a lot less bad, but still very, very bad. It was a Prop 10, what was that, long time ago? 108? Yeah. So, one of those numbers, but that where they were denying public services to people who were to undocumented immigrants, and they lost the Latino vote in California, I think, for a generation, and haven't got it back. And it's one of the reasons California remains blue today. And I think they don't learn from that history. They're making the same mistake now by making short-term gains with their hardcore racist base and alienating a critical voting bloc. And I think it's a huge strategic mistake, and I don't understand, well, other than they don't know how to get out of it now that they're in, because the people in charge are not thinking about the midterms. They're thinking about, getting about ethnic cleansing, basically, right? That's what they want. So, and the last group I'm excited about is to see young men return to at least either to our side or to neutral. Because it was a huge swing. The manosphere, sort of, everyone talked about the manosphere. Now, if you listen to Joe Rogan and those folks, they're actually kind of sour on Trump. Mm-hmm. They had Mamdani on, and they loved him, right? So I guess Mamdani can charm anybody, right? So, those voters swung back. The young men also swung back in Virginia and in New Jersey. And so what was supposed to be a 7 or 8 point race in Jersey or a 9 and 10 point race in Virginia, we're in the double digits in both states. So that's a polling miss, right? Polling miss to our side. And polling misses to our side and off your elections means next year, when you see the polls, they're not actually accounting for the Democratic enthusiasm gap. So the Democrats in the latest polls are +9 on enthusiasm. And that won't all show up in polls, because the polls are just taking usually of registered voters. The people who are actually going to show up are the really diehard ones who have an axe to grind, right? And there's lots of reasons people are upset. Affordability being the top of it, but also the loss of our democratic rights, the abuse of the immigration by immigration agents, and the trampling of the rule of law left and right. So I think that it's going to be a blue wave, maybe a blue tsunami, right?
And we will drink to that. Thank you to Diamond Mountain Winery. Everyone, let's give a big, huge round of applause to RJ. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, no. Yes, sit first. No. Wow. I'm in tears for you. That was just so beautiful. Everybody's, standing up and applause. We really, really appreciate the work that you do, and the commentary does save a lot of us, saves our lives, some of us. So if you aren't already following Jay, please do that. Subscribe, share, like The Status Quo on Substack, or you can find him on Facebook. Anywhere else? Instagram?
And Instagram is Read the Status Quo, right?
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you to all of you who are here with us today. Thank you to the Human Rights Campaign, especially the San Francisco committee who supported this program, who showed up today. And of course, thanks again to Diamond Mountain Winery. We're going to go out there, we're going to have some wine, but we also have some other refreshments just to hang and chill and meet Jay if you're here. Thank you to our online audience. Thank you to Dion Lim, who is here with us tonight as our special guest. And also to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California. If you enjoyed tonight's program, you can head to commonwealthclub.org/MMS for my programs, or commonwealthclub.org for every other event that we do here. Thank you so much. Be safe, be well, take care of yourself.